Part 1. The story begins with a clash of words, images and declarations that shook the digital and political landscape. It starts not on the battlefield, but in the media, where words can sometimes be more powerful than artillery. For weeks, Russian state television and propagandists celebrated what they called the liberation of Kupiansk, presenting it as another decisive victory on the front. Footage of medals, official briefings and triumphant tones filled the screens. General Colonel Sergei Kuzovlev appeared before cameras, reporting to President Vladimir Putin that the city was entirely under Russian control. According to him, only small scattered groups of the enemy remained. Remnants, as he said, soon to be cleared. That report was broadcast across all pro-government channels, framed as the next milestone in what Moscow called the steady advance westward. Even Putin himself seemed to believe it, asking with a tone of finality, "So it's all done completely?" To which Kuzovlev replied, "Exactly so, the city is under our control." The message was clear. Kupiansk was no longer a battlefield, but a symbol of victory. And yet, beneath that layer of certainty, doubts began to whisper. Independent analysts, war correspondents, and even some prominent Russian Z bloggers, who had long served as mouthpieces for the Kremlin's war narrative, started expressing unease. They noticed inconsistencies, videos that didn't match official claims, silence from frontline units that should have been celebrating, and a growing sense that the story of Kupiansk wasn't over, far from it. Then came the shock. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky suddenly appeared in Kupiansk, standing near the city's signpost, the name clearly visible behind him. The video spread instantly across social media, concise, calm, and devastating in its symbolism. The message required no commentary. If the city was truly liberated by Russia weeks earlier, what was the Ukrainian leader doing there, walking calmly, smiling, speaking to the camera without any sign of immediate danger? The video struck at the heart of the Kremlin's narrative. It contradicted everything that had been officially declared, not by anonymous sources or opposition voices, but by the President of Russia himself, relying on the words of his own generals. And for once, even the most loyal pro-war commentators couldn't ignore it. The reactions were immediate and chaotic. Telegram channels that had only recently boasted of victory now rushed to explain away the footage. Some claimed the video was old, a so-called conserve recorded long before the city's supposed fall. Others insisted it was AI-generated, the work of neural networks and chroma key effects, a desperate attempt to dismiss the evidence as digital trickery. Still others argued it was a gray zone, a place technically contested but symbolically Russian. But among the noise, a deeper question began to emerge. Who had deceived whom? Had General Kuzovlev and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov misled the president to secure medals and public praise? Or had they themselves been fed unreliable reports from the ground? The speculation was relentless. For the first time in months, even hardline propagandists began criticizing the Ministry of Defense, accusing it of reporting victories in advance, of presenting credit offensives, achievements taken on trust, not fact. For Zelensky, the moment was one of quiet defiance. His presence in Kupiansk, whether for minutes or hours, was a calculated risk, one designed to show that Ukraine was still capable of not just resisting, but reclaiming. He appeared calm, speaking not of vengeance but of perseverance, of continuing the struggle both on the battlefield and in diplomacy. The contrast could not have been sharper. While Russian media glorified reports of total control, the Ukrainian president appeared on the same ground, unguarded, defying that claim. The international reaction followed swiftly. Western outlets picked up the footage, analyzing every frame. Satellite images and geolocation experts confirmed. The video was indeed recent, filmed at the Kupiansk entrance sign. No chroma key, no AI fabrication. The shockwave spread from Telegram channels to the Kremlin itself, where questions of credibility began to hang heavily in the air. Russian propagandists scrambled. Some, like Maxim Kalashnikov of Roy TV, tried to mock the event, calling Zelensky's visit a reckless stunt. Others, such as political analyst Sergei Markov, attempted to frame it as proof of psychological instability, insisting that the Ukrainian president's decision to visit the front was irresponsible. Yet their tone betrayed unease, because behind every word lay the unspoken admission: if Zelensky was there, Russia was not. In the following hours, the internet lit up with speculation, sarcasm, and disbelief. Commentators joked bitterly that if Kupiansk was liberated, Zelensky must have crossed the Russian border just by entering. The irony was impossible to ignore. Even some Russian soldiers' channels joined the mockery, posting lines like, "So if we freed Kupiansk and Zelensky came there, did he invade Russia?" But for now, the official silence from Moscow spoke louder than any comment. There were no press releases correcting the earlier claims, no statements acknowledging the discrepancy. Just the growing unease of a narrative collapsing under its own weight. And this is where the story truly begins, not with the clash of armies, but with the collapse of a lie. Subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next will reveal not just the truth about Kupiansk, but the deep fracture inside Russia's own propaganda machine. When the video of Volodymyr Zelensky in Kupiansk appeared, it was as if a single short clip had detonated in the middle of Russia's information front. The Ukrainian president stood beside the city's sign, calm, composed, and perfectly aware of the symbolic power of the moment. He spoke briefly, thanking the defenders of Ukraine and reminding viewers that strength on the battlefield builds strength at the diplomatic table. His words were measured, but the implications thundered far beyond that quiet roadside. Because the simple fact of his presence contradicted a story that Moscow had already carved into its official narrative, repeated by generals, televised by state media, and even used by Vladimir Putin himself to prove that the situation at the front is under full control. In the Kremlin's carefully scripted reality, Kupiansk had fallen weeks earlier. Russian reporters were shown maps where the city was shaded red. Commentators celebrated the liberation as part of a larger operation supposedly sealing off the Oskil River line. And then, on December 12, 2025, the Ukrainian president appeared there in daylight. His team did not hide his location. They did not attempt to disguise the background. The message was brutally simple: Russia was not in control. What followed was a storm unlike anything seen since the beginning of the war. Telegram channels erupted, Z propagandists turned on one another, and disbelief turned into anger. General Sergei Kuzovlev, who only 3 weeks earlier had been awarded the Hero of the Russian Federation medal, suddenly became the symbol of embarrassment. Screenshots of the Kremlin ceremony flooded social media, accompanied by mocking captions. A medal for a city that isn't ours. The same day, journalists began revisiting the footage from November 20, when Kuzovlev, standing before Putin, confidently declared the operation complete. "The city is fully under control," he had said. "Only small dispersed enemy groups remain." Putin's approving nod from that moment now circulated as a meme of misplaced confidence. Even among the most devoted pro-war bloggers, frustration boiled over. Some, like Rybar, one of the largest Russian military channels, admitted that they had doubted some of the statements about Kupiansk, but shared them anyway because they came from trusted official sources. Rybar's tone grew bitter. Now the enemy uses our premature reports to mock us and to question every statement of the Russian army. Another well-known voice, Roman Saponkov, posted with dry irony. If this video is not chroma key, then it is clear that the only way out of the positional deadlock is to ban Telegram. Only then can reports to the president continue smoothly. The sarcasm was sharp, but it revealed despair. The realization that propaganda itself had become a trap. The excuses came quickly. Some claimed Zelensky's video was a fake. Others said it was recorded earlier. Several suggested that the footage had been filmed in a nearby village, merely resembling Kupiansk. Yet open-source investigators dismantled those claims within hours, matching signs, road angles, and terrain. The result was undeniable. Zelensky's team had been there, on the ground, in a location Russia officially declared liberated 3 weeks earlier. The collapse of credibility spread through Russian online spaces faster than any shelling. But while official voices scrambled, The reaction from within the Russian ultranationalist community revealed deeper fractures. Fighters and bloggers from paramilitary units, including the infamous Rusich detachment, mocked the confusion. So if we took Kupiansk and Zelensky came there, does it mean he violated Russia's border or got captured? One post read. The irony was painful, because it exposed the absurdity of the official narrative. Either the Russian army had lied, or the Ukrainian president had somehow crossed into Russian territory and returned safely, both impossible within the logic of victory. Meanwhile, Ukrainian media and Western analysts treated the event as a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Zelensky's brief visit accomplished what no diplomatic statement could have achieved. It shattered weeks of Russian claims, humiliated the command chain, and re-energized the Ukrainian public.
The footage circulated across networks in Europe and the United States, reinforcing the image of a leader unafraid to step into danger. Kyiv's communication strategy once again outplayed Moscow's machinery of propaganda, and this time the blow landed directly on the credibility of Putin's top generals. Inside Russia, the information chain began to crack. War correspondents like Yuri Podolyaka, long considered among the most loyal voices, published detailed analysis trying to rationalize how the event could have happened. Podolyaka wrote that Zelensky's team might have temporarily cleared the area of Russian drones, allowing a 5 to 7 minute window to record the video and leave before Russian artillery could react. His tone was cautious, almost apologetic. He admitted that the precise spot where Zelensky stood was never fully under Russian control. It was an attempt to preserve both narratives, that Russia had indeed advanced, but perhaps not as much as reported. Yet in doing so, he confirmed what critics already suspected, that the official version of total control was exaggerated. At the same time, other analysts, including the once fiercely loyal propagandist Sergei Markov, chose a different tactic. Instead of addressing the military failure, he turned to psychology. In a long Telegram post, Markov argued that Zelensky's visit was not bravery but emotional instability. He wrote that the Ukrainian president is losing adequacy, using language carefully chosen to align with the Kremlin's portrayal of Zelensky as irrational. But Markov's argument stumbled over its own contradictions. He admitted that Russia had guaranteed Zelensky's personal safety early in the war, suggesting that Putin himself once offered security assurances, a revelation that many Russians found shocking. Then, attempting to reconcile the paradox, Markov concluded that Zelensky's decision to visit a dangerous area only to provoke Putin was proof of psychological imbalance. It was a rhetorical escape, but an unconvincing one. For independent observers, the scene looked different. What happened in Kupiansk was not just a symbolic act. It exposed how Russia's chain of command had turned into a theater of self-deception. Reports of victories were sent upward before they were real, each layer of bureaucracy eager to please the next. In the process, fact became fiction, and fiction became policy. The Kremlin system, built on avoiding bad news, created an illusion so complete that even Putin believed it. When that illusion collided with reality, in the form of Zelensky's unshakable presence, the damage was immense. Across Russian Telegram, anger gave way to cynicism. Some channels openly mocked the Ministry of Defense, suggesting that generals liberate the same cities repeatedly. Others published sarcastic timelines. Kupiansk liberated October, liberated again November, visited by Zelensky December. Next liberation scheduled for January. The humor was dark, but the underlying message was clear. Trust in official war reporting was eroding even among the faithful. Inside Ukraine, the response was the opposite, a surge of pride mixed with cautious optimism. For soldiers stationed near Kupiansk, Zelensky's appearance was both a morale boost and a signal that their efforts were visible. For civilians, it became proof that the government had not abandoned contested areas. "If he can go there, so can we return someday," said one displaced resident interviewed by Ukrainian television. Internationally, the visit was interpreted as part of a broader campaign to demonstrate Ukraine's resilience as it entered another winter of war. But the aftermath in Russia was far more dramatic.
State television avoided mentioning the video for nearly 2 days, then referred to it only in passing, describing it as a possible provocation. Yet the silence of top officials spoke volumes. Neither the Ministry of Defense nor the Kremlin issued clarifications about the supposed liberation. The once celebrated General Kuzovlev disappeared from public view. His name stopped appearing in military briefings.
Sources whispered that an internal review had been ordered, though no confirmation followed. In a system obsessed with appearances, public humiliation was punishment enough. Meanwhile, channels like Rybar and Wargonzo began offering alternative explanations, each less convincing than the last. They spoke of temporary withdrawals, gray zones, and tactical pauses, avoiding any admission that the Ukrainian flag still flew within the city limits. Yet no explanation could erase the image of Zelensky calmly standing beneath the Kupiansk sign. It was the kind of moment that reshapes narratives, not with rhetoric, but with undeniable presence. And while Russia's information apparatus tried to recover, another layer of the story unfolded. Putin himself had, only weeks earlier, invited foreign journalists, including Western correspondents, to visit Kupiansk to confirm the situation on the ground. That invitation now looked absurd. The same journalists he had challenged were now citing Ukrainian footage to demonstrate the opposite of what he had claimed. The Kremlin's attempt to control the story backfired, turning into a public relations disaster that even loyal outlets could not fully ignore. By mid-December, analysts began calling the episode the Kupiansk Gambit. It became shorthand for the way propaganda can collapse when confronted with reality. The episode revealed a simple truth: victory cannot be declared into existence. And for a regime built on spectacle and control, that realization cut deeper than any battlefield loss. Yet even as Russia's information space burned with accusations and excuses, a more strategic question arose in Kiev. What would come next? Could this moment of moral advantage translate into tangible military progress? For now, the Ukrainian command remained silent. The army continued operations in the east, while diplomatic circles in Europe and Washington used the event as fresh evidence of Moscow's dishonesty. Still, the emotional core of the story remained the same. One leader standing in a place his enemy claimed to hold, defying the very machinery built to erase him. That single appearance had undermined months of Russian storytelling, exposed the fragility of its command structure, and reminded the world that propaganda collapses not when confronted by argument, but when faced by undeniable proof. And yet, the most intriguing developments were still to come, because behind the visible clash of narratives, something far more consequential began to stir. A quiet reckoning among the very people who had built Russia's illusion of victories. Their reactions, their words, their sudden silence, all of it painted a portrait of a system beginning to doubt itself. Stay with us, because the third part will take you deeper into those hidden reactions, their behind-the-scenes fallout, and the political ripples spreading from the Kremlin's gilded halls to the front lines of a war that is increasingly being fought not only with weapons, but with truth itself. Part 3. The aftermath of the Kupiansk scandal did not fade quickly. In fact, it became one of the most discussed events inside Russia's military and political circles since the beginning of the war. The shock of being publicly contradicted by a single video from the Ukrainian president set off waves of confusion and quiet panic within the Kremlin's hierarchy. For a regime built on perception rather than transparency, the exposure of its most carefully crafted narrative was more than a temporary embarrassment. It was a strategic blow. What followed in the days after Zelensky's appearance was not only a media crisis, but a deep rupture of trust within the Russian system itself. Inside Moscow, meetings began behind closed doors. Sources close to the Ministry of Defense described a tense atmosphere where senior officers exchanged accusations, each attempting to shift blame for the Kupiansk misunderstanding. The issue was not only that the city had not been fully captured, it was that reports had been falsified and passed upward without verification. Commanders at the front, eager to demonstrate progress, had exaggerated their successes. Staff officers at headquarters, unwilling to challenge the narrative,
polished those claims for political consumption, and by the time the information reached the president, it had transformed into an official truth. The Russian leader repeated it publicly, on camera, and that made the deception irreversible. When Zelensky's video surfaced, it revealed not just a lie, but the fragile machinery of flattery and fear that sustained the entire command chain. Analysts compared the situation to a military version of the Potemkin village, where reality existed only on paper and in edited footage. Even veteran propagandists, used to defending the indefensible, struggled to find words. The usually confident War Gonzo channel, known for its aggressive tone, limited itself to a short post about difficult operational dynamics and the need for patience. Others turned silent altogether. A few openly questioned why no one from the Ministry of Defense took responsibility. When a private lies to a commander, he faces a tribunal, wrote one pro-Russian blogger. But when a general lies to the president, he receives a medal. The phrase spread across social networks faster than any official denial. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian side exploited the moment masterfully.
Within hours of Zelensky's visit, Kiev's information agencies released additional footage, short interviews with soldiers and local residents confirming the ongoing Ukrainian presence in Kupiansk and its outskirts. Western journalists verified the location through satellite imagery. The story dominated international headlines, accompanied by images contrasting Zelensky's visit with earlier clips of Putin in heavily guarded, sterile settings hundreds of kilometers from the front. The symbolism was powerful and impossible to ignore. One leader walking through contested terrain with minimal protection, the other surrounded by layers of security and scripted deference. Western analysts interpreted the incident as part of a larger pattern, the slow unraveling of Russia's ability to control the narrative of the war. Since early 2022, Moscow's propaganda machine had managed to maintain the illusion of steady success, even amid military setbacks. But as the conflict dragged into its fourth year, the gap between propaganda and reality widened. The Kupiansk episode was the moment when that gap became visible to everyone, including the Russian public. It was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was a contradiction caught on camera. Inside Russia, the Kremlin responded in the only way it knew, by tightening control. State media received new guidelines forbidding the use of the word Kupiansk, unless accompanied by the phrase "tactical operation ongoing." Independent Telegram channels reporting on the incident were quietly blocked or shadow banned. Some bloggers disappeared from their channels without explanation, and smaller pro-war outlets suddenly went silent. But censorship could not erase what had already circulated through millions of phones and private chats. Russians had seen Zelensky there, and no official narrative could convince them otherwise. Amid this chaos, rumors spread about the fate of General Sergei Kuzovlev. According to several sources, he was removed from his command post and sent on indefinite leave. Others claimed he remained in his position but had been instructed to avoid any public appearances. The truth remained murky, but the absence of any mention of his name in state news confirmed that something had changed. Likewise, Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, faced renewed scrutiny. Military insiders whispered that he had been warned by the presidential administration about the consequences of unreliable reporting. Yet no formal punishment followed. The system did not correct itself, it simply buried its mistakes deeper. And as Moscow scrambled, Kiev's strategy became clearer. Zelensky's appearance in Kupiansk was not just a symbolic act, but part of a calculated information campaign aimed at undermining Russia's internal confidence. Ukrainian intelligence knew that showing the world a simple, verifiable fact would trigger a storm far greater than any propaganda could withstand. By turning truth itself into a weapon, Ukraine had found a way to strike the Kremlin where it was most vulnerable, in its credibility. The effect rippled across the battlefield. Ukrainian troops, emboldened by the psychological impact, intensified localized counterattacks in the east. Russian soldiers on the front lines, reading conflicting news from both sides, were left uncertain whether they were advancing or retreating. Confusion became as dangerous as enemy fire.
The Kupiansk Gambit, as Russian commentators began to call it, soon took on a life of its own. It became a shorthand for the collapse of staged victories and inflated reports. Even loyal propagandists like Alexander Kots hinted at frustration, writing that, "Sometimes we do not need to exaggerate to inspire people, we need to tell the truth." But telling the truth was not part of the Kremlin's design. Instead, new efforts were launched to drown out the controversy with fresh victories, claims of advances in Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, reports of encirclements that, as analysts quickly noticed, could not be verified. The cycle of misinformation continued, though now under the heavy shadow of doubt. Internationally, the Kupiansk episode influenced the tone of diplomatic discussions. Western governments, particularly in Europe, used the event to reinforce the argument that Russia's official statements could no longer be trusted in any negotiation. In Washington, officials pointed to the footage as proof of Ukraine's enduring control over contested regions. It also re-energized support packages in parliaments that had grown skeptical of prolonged aid. The image of Zelensky standing calmly in Kupiansk carried political weight far beyond its geographic coordinates. It became a rallying symbol of resilience and truth against manipulation. Meanwhile, in Russia, the psychological toll deepened. Soldiers' relatives, already distrustful of official casualty reports, began demanding clearer information about the situation near Kupiansk. In regional media, obituaries for fallen troops contradicted the ministry's claims of stability. Every inconsistency added fuel to public skepticism. Some military families posted messages online directly referencing Zelensky's video. "If our army controls Kupiansk, where did my son die?" Those questions were quickly deleted, but screenshots continued to circulate. The Kremlin's inability to manage the fallout was striking. Even Putin's rare public comments in late December carried an unusual defensiveness. Speaking at a televised meeting, he vaguely mentioned temporary complexities in the Kupiansk direction, insisting that overall goals remain unchanged. The phrasing was uncharacteristically cautious. Gone were the sweeping declarations of triumph. Instead, there was a tone of weariness, as if acknowledging that control over truth itself was slipping. On Ukrainian social media, the reaction was jubilant, but also reflective. Commentators emphasized that Zelensky's visit was not about mockery, but about reclaiming dignity. "It is not just a photo," one journalist wrote. "It is a reminder that truth is a weapon when used with courage." That sentiment resonated across Europe, where the Kupiansk story came to represent a broader lesson about authoritarian regimes. When lies become policy, exposure becomes revolution. By early January 2026, the Kupiansk controversy had reshaped the landscape of both information and morale. For Ukraine, it was a moment of resurgence, a demonstration that strategic communication could rival military power. For Russia, it was a wound to its self-image, one that propaganda could not easily conceal. Generals continued to issue optimistic briefings, but their words now sounded hollow, their audiences smaller. The illusion of control had cracked, and through that crack poured the reality of a war that no longer obeyed Moscow's script. In the end, what began as a short video on a cold December morning became a defining event in the information war. It showed how a single act